The world looks different after Venezuela. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not the date that made headlines, but the one that should have. That was the day Nicolas Maduro was declared the winner of Venezuela's presidential election, securing a third term in a vote that, by all official accounts, was neither free nor fair. The U.S. State Department, the European Union, and a chorus of Latin American leaders immediately condemned the result, calling it a sham. The White House issued a statement reaffirming its support for opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez and hinting at further sanctions. The New York Times ran an editorial declaring Venezuela's slide into dictatorship irreversible. And just like that, the narrative was another authoritarian regime clinging to power, another failed state in America's backyard, another test of Western resolve. But here's the thing, I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of geopolitics and energy, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this moment is far more consequential than the media is letting on. What happened in Venezuela isn't just about one election. It's about the unraveling of a global order that the United States has spent the last century constructing. It's about the quiet but decisive shift in how the world's great powers, China, Russia, and the US, are redrawing their spheres of influence. And most importantly, it's about what happens when a superpower's foreign policy is no longer guided by strategy, but by inertia, domestic politics, and the dangerous illusion of control. Let me explain why the world looks different after Venezuela and why the story you've been told is only half the truth. The official what they want you to believe. If you've been following the news, the story is straightforward. Venezuela, once the richest country in Latin America, has collapsed under the weight of socialist mismanagement, corruption, and authoritarianism. Hugo Chávez's Bolivarian revolution, we're told, was a utopian experiment that bankrupted the nation, and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, has only deepened the crisis. Hyperinflation, mass emigration, and the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions have turned Venezuela into a cautionary tale about the dangers of populism. The 2024 election, in this telling, was the final nail in the coffin, a rigged vote that confirmed Maduro's status as a dictator, with the opposition's landslide victory and the popular vote erased by fraud. The U.S. response has been predictable. The Biden administration, like its predecessors, has maintained sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, frozen the regime's assets abroad, and recognized the opposition as the legitimate government. The EU has followed suit, with Josep Borrell calling the election a mockery of democracy. Even Latin American leaders who once tolerated Chávez, like Brazil's Lula da Silva, have condemned Maduro's actions, though with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The message is Venezuela is a pariah state, and the international community must stand firm against its tyranny. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not that it's entirely false and Maduro is an authoritarian, the election was rigged, and Venezuela is in economic freefall. The problem is that the story is being told in a way that obscures the deeper forces at play. It's a narrative designed to justify a policy that has failed for 2 decades, while ignoring the geopolitical earthquake happening beneath the surface. What's really happening in Venezuela? Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. First, the idea that U.S. sanctions are a targeted response to Maduro's authoritarianism is a convenient fiction. The truth is that the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government since at least 2002, when the Bush administration tacitly supported a coup against Chávez. The Obama administration declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security in 2015, paving the way for sanctions. And the Trump administration took it further, imposing a full economic embargo in 2019 and recognizing Juan Guaidó as interim president, a move that even some of Guaidó's allies later admitted was a legal and diplomatic farce. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The sanctions weren't just about democracy. They were about oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. For decades, that oil flowed north to U.S. refineries, making Venezuela a key supplier in America's energy security strategy. But after Chávez nationalized the oil industry and cozied up to Russia and China, the U.S. saw a threat. The sanctions weren't just punishment, they were a tool to strangle Venezuela's economy and force regime change. And yet, despite all this, Maduro is still in power. Why? Because the sanctions didn't work. In fact, they backfired spectacularly. The Venezuelan economy didn't collapse because of socialism, it collapsed because the US cut off its access to global markets, froze its foreign assets, and made it nearly impossible to sell oil. The result? A humanitarian catastrophe that drove 6 million Venezuelans to flee the country, while the regime tightened its grip on power. The sanctions didn't topple Maduro, they made him more entrenched. But here's the part the media isn't talking. While the US was busy trying to isolate Venezuela, China and Russia were quietly stepping in. Since 2007, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, much of it repaid in oil. Russia, meanwhile, has provided military support, investment in Venezuela's energy sector, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to the country in 2018, a move that sent a clear message to Washington. And when the US imposed its oil embargo, guess who filled the void? China and India, which now buy the majority of Venezuela's crude at a discount. So let's recap. The US tried to overthrow Maduro through sanctions, failed, and in the process, pushed Venezuela into the arms of its geopolitical rivals. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people suffered, the opposition fractured, and the regime, despite its unpopularity, survived. If this were a chess game, the US would be the player who sacrificed a queen to capture a pawn, only to realize too late that the opponent had already checkmated them. The X did geopolitical the new great game. Now, let's out. What's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for global influence between the US, China, and Russia, a struggle that is reshaping the world order in ways we're only beginning to understand. For decades, the US operated under the assumption of unipolarity, the idea that after the Cold War, America was the sole superpower, and the rest of the world would either fall in line or be left behind. That assumption led to a foreign policy of liberal, the belief that the US could, and should, spread democracy, free markets, and American values across the globe. The results have been, to put it mildly, mixed. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just failures, they were disasters that cost trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives, all while weakening America's global standing. Meanwhile, China and Russia have been playing a different game. They're not interested in exporting ideology. They're interested in power, specifically, the power to reshape the international system in their favor. China's Belt and Road Initiative, its investments in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, and its growing military presence in the South China Sea are all part of a long-term strategy to create a multipolar world where the US is no longer the sole arbiter of global affairs. Russia, for its part, has been more aggressive, using military force in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria to reassert its influence in its near abroad. Venezuela is a perfect example of this dynamic. The US sees it as a rogue state that must be contained. China and Russia see it as a strategic partner, a foothold in America's backyard, a source of oil, and a way to undermine US influence in the Western Hemisphere. And here's the they're winning. Let me tell you something that should keep policymakers in Washington up at night. In 2005, the US was Venezuela's largest oil customer, buying nearly 1.5 million barrels per day. Today, that number is zero. Meanwhile, China now imports over 600,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, and India takes another 400,000. Russia, through its state-owned oil company Rosneft, has been instrumental in helping Venezuela evade US sanctions, providing the regime with the financial lifeline it needs to survive. And in 2023, Venezuela and Iran, another US adversary, signed a 20-year cooperation agreement, deepening their economic and military ties. This isn't just about oil. It's about the erosion of US influence in a region that Washington has long considered its exclusive domain. The Monroe Doctrine, which declared Latin America off-limits to foreign powers, is effectively dead. And the US has no one to blame but itself. Military and strategic, the illusion of control. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA to the covert wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And in recent years, there have been whispers in Washington about the need for a more muscular approach to Venezuela. In 2019, then National Security Advisor John Bolton openly mused about the possibility of military action, and there have been reports of US Special Forces operating in the country. The Trump administration even considered a naval blockade to enforce the oil embargo. But here's a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would be a catastrophe. Let me be clear, I'm not saying this as a pacifist. I'm saying it as someone who has studied the failures of American military adventurism for decades. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just strategic blunders, they were disasters that destabilized entire regions and left the U.S. weaker than before. Venezuela would be no different. First, there's the question of capability. Venezuela's military is far more capable than most people realize. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Sukhoi fighter jets, and a well-trained army. It also has the support of Iran, which has been providing drones and other military technology. A U.S. invasion would not be a cakewalk. It would be a bloody, protracted conflict with no clear exit strategy. Second, there's the question of legitimacy. The U.S. has no legal basis for an invasion. Venezuela is not threatening the U.S. or its allies. It's not harboring terrorists. It's not developing nuclear weapons. An invasion would be a violation of international law, and it would unite Latin America against the U.S. in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War. Third, there's the question of what comes in. Even if the U.S. succeeded in toppling Maduro, what would replace him? The Venezuelan opposition is deeply divided, with no clear leader and no coherent plan for governing. The country is in economic ruins, its institutions hollowed out, its society polarized. The U.S. would be left holding the bag, responsible for rebuilding a nation that has been systematically destroyed by 2 decades of mismanagement and sanctions. And yet, despite all this, the hawks in Washington keep pushing for a harder line. Why? Because they've learned nothing from the past 20 years. They still believe that military force is the answer, that the U.S. can impose its will on the world through sheer power. They're wrong. The domestic political why this isn't really about Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the domestic politics. The truth is, U.S. policy toward Venezuela has never really been about Venezuela. It's been about Florida. Florida is the largest swing state in the country, and its Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities are a powerful voting bloc. For decades, politicians in both parties have dared to these communities, promising tough action against the regimes in Havana and Caracas. It's a winning strategy until it isn't. In 2016, Donald Trump won Florida by just 112,000 votes, thanks in large part to his hardline stance on Venezuela. In 2020, Joe Biden won the state by a slightly larger margin, but only after adopting a similarly tough posture. And in 2024, with the election too close to call, both parties are once again using Venezuela as a political football. The problem is that this approach has real consequences. Every time a politician in Washington calls for regime change in Venezuela, it raises expectations among the exile community. And when those expectations aren't met, when Maduro doesn't fall, when the sanctions don't work, it creates a sense of betrayal. That's why you see so much frustration among Venezuelan Americans, even as the U.S. continues to support the opposition. But here's the exile community is not monolithic. Many Venezuelans who fled the country are deeply critical of Maduro, but they're also critical of U.S. policy. They know that sanctions have made life worse for their families back home. They know that the opposition is divided and ineffective. And they're tired of being used as political pawns. The Biden administration, to its credit, has tried to walk a fine line. It has maintained sanctions but also engaged in limited diplomacy, including a brief thaw in 2023 that led to the release of some political prisoners and a temporary easing of oil sanctions. But it's a delicate balancing act, and one that's constantly under attack from both the left and the right. The left accuses Biden of being too tough on Venezuela, of prioritizing geopolitics over human rights. The right accuses him of being too soft, of betraying the cause of democracy. And the truth is, both sides are wrong. The real problem isn't the policy, it's the lack of a coherent strategy. The U.S. is stuck in a cycle of sanctions and rhetoric, with no clear path forward. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this leave us? Let's look at the possible scenarios, because none of them are good. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, Maduro, facing mounting pressure from within his own ranks and the threat of further sanctions, agrees to a negotiated transition. The opposition, led by Edmundo González, takes power in a unity government, with guarantees for the military and the ruling party. The U.S. lifts sanctions, and Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding its economy. China and Russia, seeing the writing on the wall, reduce their involvement but maintain some influence. This is the scenario that the Biden administration is hoping for. It's the least bad option. But it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to step down, and the opposition has no leverage. Even if a deal were reached, the transition would be messy, and Venezuela's problems would be far from over. Scenario 2, the most likely case. In this scenario, Maduro clings to power, but the country continues to deteriorate. The economy remains in shambles, the opposition fractures, and the regime becomes increasingly reliant on China and Russia for survival. The U.S. maintains sanctions but avoids military intervention, instead focusing on containment. Venezuela becomes a failed state, a source of instability in the region, and a cautionary tale about the limits of American power. This is the scenario we're heading toward. It's not a victory for anyone. The Venezuelan people continue to suffer, the U.S. loses influence, and China and Russia gain a foothold in America's backyard. But it's the path of least resistance, and that's why it's the most likely outcome. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, the situation spirals out of control. The U.S., frustrated by the lack of progress, imposes even harsher sanctions or even considers military action. Maduro, feeling cornered, cracks down harder on the opposition, leading to mass protests and violence. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to challenge U.S. influence, increased their support for the regime. Venezuela becomes a proxy war, with the U.S. and its allies on one side and Russia and China on the other. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. It's not inevitable, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire region. Grand strategy: the end of American hegemony. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. What's happening in Venezuela is a symptom of a much larger the collapse of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it could reshape the world in its image. It could spread democracy, free markets, and human rights through military force, economic pressure, and diplomatic coercion. It could maintain its dominance through a network of alliances, military bases, and economic institutions. And it could do all this while ignoring the rising powers that were quietly building their own spheres of influence. That assumption was always flawed. It ignored the lessons of history, that empires rise and fall, that power is finite, that no nation can dominate the world forever. And it ignored the reality of the 21st century, that the US is no longer the sole superpower, that China and Russia are ascendant, and that the rest of the world is no longer willing to accept American hegemony. Venezuela is a perfect example of this. The US tried to impose its will on the country, and it failed. It tried to isolate Venezuela, and it ended up isolating itself. It tried to weaken Maduro, and it ended up strengthening China and Russia. And in the process, it revealed the limits of American power. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader pattern of U.S. foreign policy over the last 2 decades. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, these weren't just failures, they were symptoms of a deeper problem. The U.S. has been trying to do too much, with too little, for too long. It has been guided by ideology rather than strategy, by short-term political considerations rather than long-term interests. And the result has been a series of disasters that have weakened America's position in the world. Now, I'm not saying that the U.S. should retreat from the world. That would be just as dangerous as overreach. But what I am saying is that the U.S. needs a new grand strategy, one that recognizes the reality of a multipolar world, that prioritizes restraint over intervention, alliances over unilateralism, and diplomacy over coercion. The question isn't whether America should lead, it's whether it can afford to keep leading the way it has. And the answer, after Venezuela, is increasingly it can't. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about failed regime change or economic sanctions backfiring. Venezuela is a military story too, one that reveals how the Pentagon's global posture is being quietly but decisively undermined. For decades, the U.S. has relied on a network of bases, forward deployed forces, and regional partnerships to project power across the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a 19th century relic, it was. The same pattern is playing out across the global South. In Africa, Wagner Group mercenaries are propping up regimes in Mali, the Central African Republic, and Sudan, while China builds ports and railroads. In the Middle East, Russia has turned Syria into a forward operating base, and China is quietly exiting its naval presence in the Gulf of Aden. Even in Latin America, the U.S. is losing ground. Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Honduras have all deepened ties with Beijing and Moscow in recent years. The U.S. still has more aircraft carriers and stealth bombers than anyone else, but what good are they if the other side is writing the rules of engagement? Here's the thing about military power in the 21st: it's not just about who has the biggest guns. It's about who controls the infrastructure, the supply chains, the intelligence networks, and the narrative. The U.S. spent the last 20 years fighting insurgencies in the Middle East, while China and Russia were building the foundations of a new world order. They didn't need to invade countries to win influence, they just needed to offer an alternative to American dominance. And in Venezuela, they did exactly that. So what does this mean for U.S. grand strategy? First, it means accepting that the era of unipolarity is over. The U.S. can no longer assume that it can intervene anywhere, anytime, without consequences. Second, it means rethinking the role of military force. The Pentagon's obsession with high-tech warfare, drones, cyber, hypersonic missiles is important, but it's not enough. What matters now is the ability to project power without triggering a great power conflict. And third, it means recognizing that economic statecraft is just as important as military might. Sanctions can work, but only if they're part of a broader strategy that includes diplomacy and engagement. In Venezuela, the U.S. used sanctions as a blunt instrument, and the result was a strategic disaster. The Biden administration has tried to adjust, but old habits die hard. In 2022, the U.S. quietly eased some sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections. But when Maduro reneged on the deal, the U.S. had no leverage left. Why? Because it had already burned its bridges with the opposition, and it had no credible military option. The lesson here is that coercion without engagement is a recipe for failure. If the U.S. wants to compete in a multipolar world, it needs to be willing to talk to its adversaries, not just to impose its will, but to find areas of mutual interest. Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's a warning. The U.S. can no longer afford to treat the global South as a chessboard where it moves pieces at will. The world has changed, and America's strategy hasn't. If Washington doesn't adapt, it will keep losing, not because it lacks power, but because it refuses to see the world as it is, rather than as it wishes it to be. And in geopolitics, that's the most dangerous mistake of all. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's domestic political landscape is far more complex than the binary narrative of dictatorship versus democracy that dominates Western headlines. The reality is that Maduro's regime has survived not just through repression or foreign patronage, but by mastering the art of controlled fragmentation, a strategy that keeps the opposition divided, the military loyal, and the population just stable enough to avoid total collapse. This isn't some accidental outcome, it's the result of deliberate institutional decay, where the state has been hollowed out and repurposed as a tool for elite survival rather than governance. Let me explain why this matters. When I was in Caracas in 2019, during the height of the Guaidó moment, the streets were a theater of competing realities. On one side, you had the opposition energized, organized, and backed by the full weight of U.S. recognition, marching under the banner of a parallel government. On the other, you had Maduro's state, which had long since abandoned any pretense of functioning as a modern republic. The courts were packed, the legislature was neutered, and the electoral council was a rubber stamp. But here's the uncomfortable: the opposition's biggest mistake wasn't its lack of international support. It was its inability to recognize that Maduro's power didn't rest on legitimacy, it rested on control of the few remaining levers of coercion and patronage. Take the military, for instance. The Bolivarian National Armed Forces aren't some monolithic block of ideologues. They're a fractured institution where loyalty is bought through a mix of corruption, fear, and the promise of survival. The generals who matter, the ones running the gold mines in Bolivar State, the ones overseeing the cocaine routes through the Caribbean, the ones embedded in the state-owned oil company PDVSA, have no incentive to defect. Why would they? The system has made them rich, and the alternative is prosecution, either by a future Venezuelan government or by the U.S. Department of Justice. In 2020, when the Trump administration indicted Maduro and several top military officials on drug trafficking charges, it wasn't a strategic masterstroke. It was a gift to Maduro, because it gave the generals a reason to close ranks. The message was, if you abandon the regime, you'll end up in a Miami courtroom. Then there's the opposition itself. For years, the U.S. and its allies treated figures like Juan Guaidó as if they were the sole legitimate representatives of the Venezuelan people. But Guaidó's rise was as much a product of Washington's desperation as it was of domestic politics. The opposition coalition, the Democratic Unity Roundtable, had been fracturing for years, torn apart by infighting, ego, and the sheer difficulty of organizing under a repressive regime. By 2021, Guaidó's approval rating had plummeted to 15%, according to Dataanalysis, a respected polling firm. The problem wasn't just that Maduro was better at repression, it was that the opposition had failed to offer a compelling alternative. They promised democracy, but they couldn't deliver basic services. They denounced corruption, but they couldn't explain how they'd fix the economy. And most damningly, they allowed themselves to be seen as proxies of foreign powers rather than as a genuine movement for change. Here's where the scenario projections get interesting. There are three plausible paths forward for Venezuela, and none of them are particularly encouraging for those hoping for a swift return to democracy. The first is what I call the Zimbabwe scenario, a slow, managed decline into a de facto one-party state. Maduro isn't going anywhere, but he's also not in full control. The economy remains a basket case, but the regime survives by allowing just enough informal commerce to keep the population from starving. The military and the ruling elite carve up the remaining assets, gold, oil, drugs, while the opposition is reduced to a permanent protest movement with no real power. This is the most likely outcome in the short to medium term. It's not pretty, but it's stable in the way that a low-grade fever is. It doesn't kill you, but it doesn't make you better either. The second path is the Cuban scenario, a full-blown authoritarian consolidation, where the regime tightens its grip through digital surveillance, mass arrests, and the elimination of any remaining political space. This would require Maduro to double down on repression, which he's shown he's willing to do. The problem is that Venezuela isn't Cuba. It's a much larger country with a more diverse economy, and it's deeply integrated into global illicit networks. The Cuban model works because the island is small, isolated, and dependent on a single patron. Venezuela doesn't have that luxury. If Maduro tries to go full Castro, he risks triggering a mass exodus that could destabilize the region even further. Colombia and Brazil, already struggling with their own political crises, can't absorb another wave of migrants. And the U.S., despite its tough talk, has shown no appetite for military intervention. The third path is the Sudan scenario, a sudden, violent collapse followed by a fragmented power struggle. This is the least likely but most dangerous outcome. If the military fractures, if the economy implodes, or if Maduro dies without a clear successor, Venezuela could descend into a multi-sided civil conflict. We've seen this movie before, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. The difference is that Venezuela has oil, gold, and a strategic location that makes it a prize for regional and global powers. Russia and China would try to prop up their allies. The US and its Latin American partners would back their proxies. And the result would be a proxy war fought on Venezuelan soil, with the population caught in the middle. So where does this leave US policy? The Biden administration has been trying to thread the needle, keeping sanctions in place while offering limited concessions in the hope of luring Maduro into negotiations. In 2023, they allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in Venezuela in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections. But here's the Maduro has no incentive to negotiate in good faith. Every time he's made a deal with the opposition, he's reneged. In 2016, he sabotaged a recall referendum. In 2018, he held a sham election. In 2021, he walked away from talks in Mexico. The pattern is Maduro uses negotiations to buy time, divide the opposition, and extract concessions, but he never actually gives up power. The uncomfortable truth is that the US has run out of good options. Military intervention is off the table. Regime change through sanctions has failed. And engagement without leverage is just appeasement. The only realistic path forward is a long-term strategy of containment, one that recognizes that Maduro's regime is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, but that also works to limit its influence and mitigate its worst effects. This means three things. First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a zero-sum game. If Maduro is willing to make concessions like releasing political prisoners or allowing limited opposition participation in elections, the US should be willing to reciprocate, even if it doesn't lead to immediate regime change. Second, the US needs to work with its allies in Latin America to create a regional consensus on Venezuela. The Lima Group, which once united most of the region against Maduro, has collapsed. Brazil under Lula is pursuing a policy of active non-intervention, while Colombia under Petro has taken a more conciliatory approach. The US needs to find a way to work with these governments, even if their priorities don't always align with Washington's. And third, the US needs to prepare for the long game. Venezuela's crisis isn't going to be resolved in a single election cycle. It's going to take years, if not decades, to rebuild the country's institutions, economy, and civil society. The real lesson of Venezuela isn't that authoritarianism always wins. It's that the US has lost the ability to shape outcomes in the global South through coercion alone. The world has changed, and America's strategy hasn't. If Washington wants to remain relevant, it needs to accept that power isn't just about military might or economic sanctions. It's about understanding the local dynamics, working with allies, and playing the long game. In Venezuela, the US has spent the last 2 decades trying to force a solution. The result has been a strategic disaster. The question now is whether Washington has the humility to learn from its mistakes, or whether it will keep repeating them.